The sound of the heart monitor flatlined in the midnight silence. Nurse Caroline stared at the machine, her eyes wide with fear, and something else, something darker. The patient, Mr. Harris, had been alive just moments ago, breathing softly, his face pale but steady. And now, he was gone. But why? Why would she do it? Why would Nurse Caroline, who had been so kind, so gentle with the old man, take his life? The answer to that question was buried deep, hidden in the shadows of the night, and only Caroline knew the truth. She had killed him. But what made her do it? As the clock ticked, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Caroline quickly turned off the monitor, her heart racing. She glanced around the empty hospital room, her fingers trembling as she pulled the sheet over Mr. Harris's face. The weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. The guilt, the horror, it felt like a heavy cloak draped over her shoulders. She had to act fast, before anyone discovered what she had done. But there was a problem. Someone was bound to find out. The hospital was busy, and someone would eventually come to check on Mr. Harris. The thought of being caught made her stomach churn. She needed a plan, a way to cover her tracks before the morning shift began. Suddenly, Caroline froze. She heard footsteps outside the door. Someone was coming. Her mind raced as she quickly grabbed the needle from the tray beside the bed. She had to think fast. She couldn't let anyone find out. Not now. Not ever. The door creaked open, and Dr. Lawson stepped in, his face lit up by the harsh light above. "Caroline, everything okay in here?" he asked, his voice calm, but with a touch of suspicion. Caroline forced a smile, wiping the sweat from her brow. "Yes, Dr. Lawson, everything's fine," she said, her voice shaky. She tried to keep her hand steady as she tucked the needle back into her pocket, praying he wouldn't notice the fear in her eyes. Dr. Lawson raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. "Okay," he said, giving her one last glance. "Just make sure to check on Mr. Harris in an hour. We need to keep an eye on his vitals." Caroline nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. As soon as the doctor left, she let out a sigh of relief. She couldn't believe it had worked. But her relief was short-lived, because she knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The night dragged on. Caroline went through the motions of her shift, pretending everything was normal. But inside, her mind was spinning. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone knew what she had done. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching her. But no one did. Hours later, just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the blinds, the door to Mr. Harris's room opened again. This time, it was his daughter Mary who stepped in. She was a soft-spoken woman, always polite and worried about her father's health. But today, there was something different about her. She looked suspicious. "Good morning, Nurse Caroline," she said, her voice low. "How's my father doing?" Caroline forced another smile. "He's resting. We've been keeping a close eye on him." Mary didn't look convinced. Her eyes scanned the room, and for a brief moment, they locked with Caroline's. It felt like the room grew colder, the air heavier. Caroline's heart skipped a beat. "Is everything really okay?" Mary asked, taking a step forward. "You look a little off." Before Caroline could respond, the sound of a phone ringing cut through the tension. It was the hospital's emergency line. Caroline quickly grabbed the receiver, grateful for the distraction. "Hello, Nurse Caroline speaking," she said, her voice trembling. "Get to Mr. Harris's room now," came the voice on the other end. It was Dr. Lawson's voice, urgent and sharp. "Something's wrong." Caroline's stomach dropped. She didn't have to ask what was wrong. The truth was out. Mr. Harris was dead, and she was the one who had killed him. She hung up the phone and turned to Mary, her mind racing. "I have to go check on something," she said quickly, her heart pounding. "Please, wait here." Mary nodded, but there was an unreadable look in her eyes. "I'll wait." Caroline fled the room, her feet carrying her down the hall, her mind whirling. How had they found out so soon? And why was Mary acting so strange? Something didn't add up. As Caroline reached the nurse's station, she was greeted by an unexpected sight. Dr. Lawson standing with a handful of papers. His face was grave, his eyes full of concern. "Caroline, we need to talk," he said. But before she could respond, the overhead lights flickered. Then, everything went black. In the pitch-dark hallway, Caroline's heart skipped a beat. What was happening? Was this part of the plan? The last thing she remembered was the eerie sound of Mary's voice calling out to her from the dark. Then, the lights came back on, and there, in the hallway, stood Mary. But she wasn't alone. A tall, dark figure stood beside her, a shadow looming in the light. The figure stepped forward. It was Mr. Harris. Caroline froze. Had he somehow survived? Had he faked his death? How? Why? Before she could gather her thoughts, the figure lunged toward her. The door to the nurse's station burst open. And then everything went black. As the footsteps drew closer, her heart pounded harder in her chest. Her hands were still shaking as she shoved the needle into the back pocket of her scrubs, trying to look as calm as possible. The door creaked open, and there stood Dr. Reynolds, the night shift doctor, with his usual half smile. "Everything all right in here, Caroline?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. For a moment, it felt like the room itself had frozen. Caroline's mind raced, but she quickly pushed her panic aside. She needed to think clearly. She couldn't let him see how terrified she was. "Yes, Dr. Reynolds," she replied, forcing a smile onto her lips. "Mr. Harris is resting. Just checking his vitals one last time before I leave for the night." Dr. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You sure? I thought I heard the heart monitor alarm. Didn't sound too good." Caroline's breath caught in her throat. The alarm. She had turned it off so quickly she almost forgot about it. She had to act like nothing was wrong. "Maybe it was a glitch," she said, trying to sound confident. "You know how these machines can be sometimes. I checked, and everything seemed fine." Dr. Reynolds gave her a suspicious look, but didn't push further. "All right, just make sure you log everything properly, okay?" "Of course," Caroline said quickly, nodding. Dr. Reynolds turned to leave, but just as he was about to step out the door, he hesitated. "You're sure you're all right, Caroline? You look a little off tonight." Caroline's breath hitched. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her throat dry. "I'm fine, really. Just a long shift. I'll be all right." Dr. Reynolds paused for a moment, then gave her a reassuring smile. "Okay, if you say so. Get some rest when you can. I'll see you later." With that, he left, closing the door behind him. Caroline exhaled slowly, her body sagging against the wall as relief flooded her. But it was only temporary. The guilt, the fear. It was still there, lurking in the corner of her mind. She had done it. She had killed Mr. Harris. But why? The question echoed over and over again, like a relentless drumbeat. She couldn't explain it, not fully. But she had her reasons that no one could ever understand. Caroline grabbed her phone from the nurse's station and stared at the screen. There was one number she needed to call. One person who could help her make this all disappear. She took a deep breath and dialed the number. "Hello?" a voice answered, raspy and familiar. "It's done," Caroline whispered, her voice barely audible. The line was silent for a moment. Then the voice on the other end spoke again, low and steady. "Good. Now you need to cover your tracks. You know what to do." Caroline hung up without another word, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt sick, but there was no turning back now. The next few hours passed in a blur. She made sure the chart was updated with false information, blood pressure readings that never happened, a heart rate that remained steady when it had dropped. She cleaned up the room, wiping away any traces of what had occurred. The needle she had used was carefully hidden in her bag, just in case anyone came looking. By the time the morning shift came in, everything looked normal, too normal, but something didn't feel right. Caroline could feel the weight of what she had done sitting heavily on her chest, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. The guilt gnawed at her, eating away at her from the inside. And then, just as the morning nurses began their rounds, a figure appeared in the hallway, walking briskly towards Mr. Harris's room. It was Detective Ward. Caroline froze. Detective Ward? What was he doing here? Did someone suspect something? As he approached the door, she could feel her heart beating faster, almost painfully. He was coming closer. Was he here because of Mr. Harris? Did he already know? Caroline's mind raced. But she quickly pulled herself together. She had to stay calm. She had to keep her cool. There was no way they could have figured it out so soon. Detective Ward paused in front of Mr. Harris's room. Caroline tried to act casual, but her body felt like it was betraying her. The detective knocked once, then entered without waiting for a response. Caroline watched through the small window in the door as Detective Ward stepped inside the room. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see him talking to someone. Who was he talking to? Her stomach churned. The detective was not alone. A man in a hospital gown was sitting on the bed. It was Mr. Harris. But how? He was supposed to be dead. The flatline, the needle. It didn't make sense. The room started to spin. Caroline's mind reeled. Had she made a mistake? Was Mr. Harris alive this whole time? Or had she just imagined it all? The detective turned to her and caught her gaze through the window. His eyes narrowed. Caroline's breath hitched. What did he know? What had he figured out? Before she could move, before she could react, Detective Ward turned sharply and opened the door, stepping out into the hallway. "Miss Caroline," he said calmly, but his voice was icy. "We need to talk." Carolina's heart stopped. Okay, Caroline?" His voice was softer now, as if he could sense something was off, but didn't quite know what. "You've been under a lot of stress lately. If you need a break, just let me know." Caroline's heart skipped. She couldn't afford any more attention, any more questions. She forced a smile, something that felt foreign on her face, and nodded. "I'm fine, Dr. Reynolds, just ready to get some rest after this shift." Dr. Reynolds seemed to consider this for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "All right, take care of yourself, Caroline." As he left the room, Caroline stood frozen for a few moments, listening to his footsteps fade away down the hall. Her pulse was still racing. She had narrowly escaped. But she knew the worst wasn't over yet. She turned back to Mr. Harris, lying still in the bed. His body was already cold, but the crime had only just begun to unfold. Caroline had taken his life in cold blood, but it wasn't just the death that haunted her. It was the reason behind it, the desperate need to silence him forever. For weeks, Mr. Harris had been asking too many questions. Questions about the hospital, about her, and about the strange behavior of certain staff members, including Caroline herself. The old man had been dying for months, but what had started as harmless chatter had become something more dangerous. He had been getting closer to something Caroline could not afford for him to find out. She had thought she could intimidate him, maybe get him to forget, but he hadn't. Mr. Harris knew too much, and now the man who could ruin everything was gone. But as Caroline stood there, staring at the lifeless body in front of her, something gnawed at her conscience. Would anyone suspect her? Could they trace it back to her? She hadn't left any evidence, nothing that could tie her directly to the crime, but the nagging feeling in her chest told her that someone, somewhere, would start asking questions soon. She quickly left the room, ensuring to lock the door behind her, then hurried to the nurse's station to log her shift. She needed to get out of the hospital. She needed to clear her mind. And most of all, she needed to make sure no one found out what she had done. But deep down, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, that somehow, somewhere, the truth would come to light, and when it did, she would be ready. As she walked through the empty corridors, the sound of a distant door opening echoed through the silence. Caroline froze. Someone else was coming.